So I am thrilled to have Ted Arthur with us today. He is the music director for Back to the Future musical currently running at the Winter Garden Theater on Broadway. He's also the conductor of the show's Out of Time Orchestra, an 18-piece ensemble of world-class musicians he leads 8 times a week. Ted's other Broadway credits include music director for Diana, associate conductor for The Prom, and assistant conductor for Once on This Island. In addition to Back to the Future, Ted is the international associate music supervisor for Moulin Rouge. Whew. Welcome, Ted. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to this.
So, tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get involved with music? How did you know you wanted to be involved on Broadway?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I went to school for broadcast journalism and I got a degree in music, but I was going to follow the career path to become an on-air reporter. And just, a crazy run of life experiences, which it led me to kind of go into music. And I'd always loved, um, you know, Broadway and theater, and I did that in school, but I never thought of pursuing that as a career. And it kind of just led to that. And I came to New York in 2014 and didn't know anybody. And, as many people do, hit the ground running and made connections and met people. And one thing led to another. And now I'm very fortunate to be the music director for a Broadway show.
And full disclosure, if you are watching, my husband is the drummer in Ted's orchestra for Back to the Future. So that's kind of how this conversation came to be. And I was very interested in talking with you, as I mentioned, because uh, everything he's told me about your leadership style and the way that you manage this group of musicians really always sounded to me like it echoed the themes of human-centered leadership. I think one of the things I wanted to kind of start talking to you about that around was inclusion and belonging, which I know Broadway has really embraced DEI. There's a number of organizations, I believe, one of which you're a part of. Is it Muse or Muse?
News, yep.
Muse. Okay. And what does Muse stand for?
Musicians United for Social Equity.
So I guess my first question would be somewhat of a two-parter because I talk about how inclusion and belonging, sometimes those terms can get conflated. People use them interchangeably, and they're actually two distinct acts. So my first question is, how would you define, through your lens, the difference between inclusion and belonging? And what are some ways that you foster that genuine inclusion and belonging within a team of musicians?
We're very inclusive. And I'll speak through the lens of being a music director for a Broadway show at Back to the Future. And um, for me, being inclusive means in this situation just trying to cast a wide net of musicians. We're trying to increase the pipeline for diversity, whether that's gender, whether that's race or sexuality, and trying to be inclusive of all those demographics and bring people in, whether that's playing in the show or we get a lot of requests to just new musicians to the city that want to come and just see what it's like to be in a Broadway pit. And that's exactly what I did when I moved here, and sat in a bunch of pits to just meet people and gain experience and see what it's like. And for me, what I really love about Back to the Future is our pit has a lot of sense of belonging. The thing that I learned going through as I was subbing and going up the ranks in this industry was, you are in a number of different situations and environments, and you kind of remember what were great experiences and what weren't, and why they were and why they weren't. And as I was going through a number of different shows and experiences, I put in the back of my head that this is what I was going to do, or this is what I wasn't going to do when I was the leader of an orchestra. And so one of the things to me that was really important was fostering a very inclusive and welcoming environment in our orchestra. And so at Back to the Future, I do a couple of things to make people, to try to make people feel at ease, because it's a very stressful situation playing on Broadway, especially your first time. So one of the things I like to do is, if there's a sub, so we have 18 musicians and they're there and they're in charge of playing the show each night, but they obviously take off to do other things or just have a night off, and they have subs that come in and basically are them for that evening and fill that chair and that position. So we have a lot of subs coming in and out, and whenever there's a first time sub in the orchestra, the first time they've ever played the show, I, when we're right before we start, I just say, we would like to welcome so and so on French horn one who's going to be playing the show, just to acknowledge that and just make them feel welcome. I like to, before the show, just go up to them, whether they're in the pit or in the band room, and just say, hey, welcome, and have a great show tonight, and just be supportive as possible, because I think that does make a difference. And I've heard a lot of experiences and a lot of stories of people that they just feel like they show up and do the show and they're not really noticed. And so I think that's really important to foster that sense of belonging and ownership in the show, to give that one-on-one attention. And I love to do it because I think that creates a good environment. The rest of the orchestra kind of like cheers for them too. And so I think that, I'm hoping, helps to bring them in, into our group.
I really love the way that you articulated that, and I love the example of using subs. I think that, there are a lot of different industries and leadership scenarios where, your team isn't always static. You've got either people that, work remotely, or maybe are on a contractor basis or whatnot, and you have to kind of always make them feel like, they're still part of the collective. So I think that your way of saying of like, you know what, I don't just want to acknowledge that they're here. I want them to feel like they're part of the team for the night. It's like you're signaling to the rest of the musicians, like, hey, we have somebody new, like, make them one of us, show them I think that's just the absolute kind of difference between the two is one is okay, you're supposed to be here, and all right, this is where you sit, and we'll move on. And the other is like, hey, we're so glad you're here, you are welcome to be here, and we want you here, and we're going to make this all work together. The difference is just staggering, and I think too often people stop at the inclusion piece and don't go to the belonging.
Hmm. Because I think a lot of it is, a sub, their job is to show up and play the show. And there's nothing in there says that, you have to do these things, but I do think that it makes for a better working environment, and they want to do a better job, and they take more ownership in the show if they feel, like I said, some kind of belonging and personal interaction.
And I think that also maybe leads into psychological safety, which is another part of this model. And really, when you achieve like true psychological safety, it's the apex. That's when your team feels safe challenging the status quo. And I don't know that how much that applies here, but in general terms, with respect to psychological safety, how do you create comfort for the individuals under your charge to feel safe when they're learning a score, when they're, experimenting with, trying to get something right, or just kind of contributing in their roles on an ongoing basis? How do you how do you start to facilitate that environment of safety?
Well, like I said earlier, subbing on a show is, especially for the first time, is very stressful because you basically don't have a rehearsal. You come and watch the show, sitting next to the main player, and they'll give you notes of like, be careful about this section. There's a video of the conductor conducting the show so they can practice to that. But the first time they do the show is the first time they're doing the show in, in real time. And so there inevitably there's going to be something that happens that, they're not accustomed to, or maybe something different in the show that night that they weren't, prepared for, or whatever reason. And so there's a lot of stress of wanting to get it right. And I think from my perspective, because I've played in pits before as a musician and as a sub, you get a lot of the tone of the show is set by the what you see on the podium. And I've been in situations where it's been a real joy and you're getting a lot of positive um, energy from the podium. And I've also been subbing on shows where it's not positive. And if someone makes a mistake, there's kind of a dirty look, from the person on the podium. And, whether that's just a reflex or intentional, it really affects the people playing the show. And so this was another thing that I learned, that when I was going to be conducting a show, I would try very hard to not react in the moment. And because your first instinct, you hear a note is, you just like, you're like, oh, come on, but you have to remember, people are not wanting to make mistakes, and there is nothing positive comes out from kind of giving a negative feedback in the moment, and that honestly probably derails later songs in the show as well. And so um, I think to create a safe space is exhibiting positive energy and very making it very safe on the podium for people to do their best work, because it's a stressful situation.
That makes a lot of sense. And that is a little different from, say, some other leadership roles, because typically in like a more traditional, say, office corporate environment, the ideal is when you see that something hasn't been executed correctly, you give them the feedback immediately. But like you said, you're in the middle of a show, like you can't psych them out. You can't take a chance that they're gonna, get all in their head about it and miss the next cue. So how soon after do you actually get to give a sub feedback?
Usually after the show, I'll keep track of notes during the show. And what I usually do is, some people give notes right after the show. I prefer to just email them out because I can type everything up from what, my analysis of how things went. And just, and even delivering the notes is, I've found a very, um, you can do it many different ways. And so for me, I always lead with, thank you so much for taking the time to learn the show. They don't get paid to learn the show. It's all up to them. I try not to use the word notes, even though that's semantics. I just say, like, here are some thoughts for next time. Um, and, I'll just give them, however many there are, and then it's kind of a work in progress. I will say though, more of maybe what you're referring to in the corporate world, when we're putting a show together, we're in I guess, a more office situation in a rehearsal room where we're working with, we have a couple people in the music team, and we're working in a room with a choreographer and director. And, sometimes things happen where somebody misses something, like we don't have music updated, or, you know, um, we're not prepared for something. And I think it's a good learning experience. Everybody obviously wants to do a good job. And um, in that situation, yeah, in you can give feedback on a break and just say, hey, we just want to make sure that we're really uh, being on top of this. And how can we work to not let this not happen again. And it's but I think it to me, it always feels like it's in the delivery.
Definitely is. And I'm wondering, now that you've mentioned it, about, when you have a new orchestra together. I've obviously never been in that situation. I'm not the musician in the family, but it seems like it would be an incredibly high stakes situation because, as I understand it, things are changing constantly. There's a lot of personalities in the room that are in charge, and maybe have different perspectives or different opinions about how things should go. Um, again, I'm kind of just recounting what I've been told, but it's the sense also of like kind of being under the gun with time. Everything needs to kind of be done as quickly as possible and as perfect as possible. Uh, How do you, when you have a new group of musicians together, how do you start to foster that psychological safety under those circumstances?
Well, I think a good example of that in my situation would be when we're doing like a sound check or anything that's where we have the band for the first time. And in those situations, like you say, we're under the gun. We've got 3 hours. We only have 3 hours, and in that 3 hours, we have to make sure that we get through all the songs, and the sound team has to be able to, dial in all the instruments and make sure everything's mixed well in the house. And so there's just a lot of pressure to move quickly. And I think it's very easy for the conductor to feel overwhelmed because people in the back are telling you to go or to stop or to take it from this place. And I found the best way to handle that is to remain as calm as possible and to relay that information to the orchestra in a very calm and even way because it can quickly get very stressful because we have to move quickly. And the orchestra wants to be, they want to be on top of things. So, they're watching, but it can get very high stress from people in the theater giving you notes or giving you feedback or giving things for you to tell the orchestra. You're basically a conduit between the people that are listening to the orchestra and the orchestra itself. So remaining calm, I think, is the best way to just keep everybody even keeled.
So, one of the things that leaders tend to grapple most with is how to balance creating that environment of psychological safety, but also not losing the accountability factor. Because when you go too far into the psychological safety, you lose intellectual honesty, and it becomes very difficult to course correct individuals if you're afraid of hurting their feelings or not seeming supportive. But obviously, too much accountability, like you were just describing, it can feel micromanaging. So do you kind of have any special sauce techniques that you've applied that marry these two together in a healthy way?
Well, we've been doing Back to the Future for almost a year, and it's 8 shows a week, and we're doing the same show, um, for almost a year. And so, we've gotten into a situation where now we're kind of just running the show. Um, it's I feel like someone should do a study on just a long running show and the psychological effects to that because it's really interesting. I mean, we you're on Broadway and you want to do the best you can, obviously, but after you've done, now we're at 330 odd shows that we've done, it's you relax a bit, and because the show, I mean, at least the regular people know the show very well, and so we like to have a good time, and there's jokes and things happening in the pit. You probably would be surprised. I mean, it's a whole different ecosystem under the pit, under the theater, what's happening in the pit. And, we all have little bits that we do and funny little, physical things that we do and laughs and stuff. And so like that's fun. And, I think that also creates a safe space and a welcoming space, as we were saying, at the beginning. And it's easy to, after you've done the show a couple hundred times, you start hearing things that really get on your nerves, like maybe someone's playing something, just not exactly what you would like, or they've started doing that and you want to give them a note every night, but you don't do that because I think that's where we go over to the too much accountability. And so I think what I like to do is to balance that is I send out notes to our regular players in a group email once every couple of months. And these are like the big things that I think we need to make sure that we're, just brush up, clean up things. And so I like to do that. Some people do them, every week, which I think that, to me, in my personal opinion, that feels like it's a lot of that is going maybe too far. I'm not giving a lot of freedom, but I like to just to be able to, in the name of holding accountability for all of us to maintain our highest level of excellence on a Broadway show. I like to do that. I also, um, when I give out notes, I don't like giving out notes, personal notes to that are, let me start over. So when I give out notes, a lot of them are applying to the whole orchestra. But if I have a note for a single individual, I won't send that note out to everybody. So I collate and separate the notes and give them to them privately. Just I think that's a courtesy thing. And so I do that every couple of months. But it's we like to have fun. Everybody wants to do a good job, but we also have to um, clean up from time to time.
Can you think of a time in your career? It doesn't have to be Back to the Future. It could be another production where maybe you didn't get that balance quite right. Like you maybe leaned a little bit more into the psychological safety that in hindsight, maybe it was too much, or leaned a little bit too much into the accountability. Do you recall a time
I
when
don't
you,
know. That's a good question. I mean, this is the longest running show that I've been a part of, honestly. I did a show before this called Diana that lasted a couple of weeks, and then I was part of the prom, and that lasted about 8 months. I was the associate on that, so I wasn't the music director, and was not was in that position. But um, I don't know. I don't know if I've been in a position where I feel like I've gone either way at this point. I know that's not a good answer, but I again, this is something that I learned going through my experiences to get to where I am now, and realized, getting a lot of notes or getting no notes, um, and how that affected me and my psyche, and so I've always thought about that and continue to think about that on this show to try and just be as balanced as I can.
what about with your position as international associate music supervisor for Moulin Rouge? Did I get that right?
Mhm.
Do you find that there's a difference with global companies in terms of um, some of the things we've been talking about, psychological safety, inclusion, and belonging? Or do you find that it's pretty consistent from cast to cast around the world?
So I don't know. I would say there's probably cultural differences in the different shows, but I can't give you specific examples. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I think this is really interesting. So it sounds like having some capacity for cultural competence is a beneficial skill if you're going to be involved in like a international position where you're dealing with a lot of different orchestras around the world. Is there anything that you do in particular? Like, if it's like, okay, I know I'm going to be working with this new production that's opening in Moscow. I'm just making that up. Is there anything that you kind of do beforehand to get familiarized with like the culture there to have some sort of indication going in as to what might resonate?
I mean, that's a good question. I'm trying to think, like with Germany and Korea, where there's a lot of translating that needs to happen with the score, and it's figuring out what's going to resonate um, with the local population there. Like for instance, Germany, interestingly enough, Moulin Rouge is filled with music that's globally known, pop songs. And the real question was, well, do we do them in English because that's what everybody knows? They know the English pop songs. Or do we translate them into German because the lyrics help to tell the story? And maybe they don't understand the English words, although that's what they hear on US, TV and radio. And so there was a lot of blending and back and forth of like, no, let's put this phrase in German and let's put this phrase in English, or this sounds better translated in German, keeping it in German. So like that was a really interesting process to go through. And then it's like little things which I'll never forget. We were in band rehearsals in Germany, and some of the music uh, in Moulin Rouge is improv. So there's like maybe the guitar will have what we call slashes, and in certain sections of music, and that means they can basically just play whatever they want in the style. And so we were doing the song "Come What May," and the guitarist was playing, and it was electric guitar, and it started sounding a little too country, um, from what we're used to. And that was just his interpretation. And so I gave that note. I said, just what you're doing, just maybe make it a little more contemporary. It's sounding a little, or pop. It's just sounding a little too country. And he responded saying, "Well, what country would that be?" And so that made me really, that made me laugh, because it's the context of these things you're just not used to. He thinks, or at least he thought that country meant, um, pop, our country music is and pop music are the same to them, apparently. And so he didn't really understand the question. So it's that kind of stuff that you discover along the way that's interesting.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
So culturally, I think that also leads into the cultural component of it as well.
And it makes you think like there's so many things shorthand that we take for granted. Everybody would probably understand that note in New York, but take it across the pond to a different culture. And yeah, I could see where there would be some cross wires of, what you were intending to communicate and what was actually received.
Yeah.
I love kind of just how you seem to really you come across as just being super comfortable in your own skin. And part of my theory is that a leader who shows up authentically is comfortable balancing vulnerability and transparency in their leadership style. How true is this for you? And where might you struggle at times?
Oh, well, no, I feel like I'm very authentic on the podium and when I show up to work.
Between vulnerability and transparency, is there one that is a little bit more difficult for you to demonstrate as a leader?
Um, I think both can have difficulty. If there's a situation where I need to say something to, an actor or a musician, um, you know, I sometimes you want to be transparent, but you also want to make sure you're not being too blunt or hurt someone's feelings. Like for instance, it kind of comes across harsh if I go up to someone, an actor, and I say, you're really flat tonight. You're singing really like under the pitch. Um, like that's a very, direct note, and so usually I'll say, hey, could you hear the orchestra tonight? It just didn't lock in as well as it usually does. And so there's ways to approach these notes with actors or to musicians, where you're still being transparent and giving the note, but you're not being as blunt as you could be, I guess. Um, being vulnerable, um, is it can be hard because I think when you make a mistake as the conductor, you're on camera. So it's like there's just something about being on camera, making a mistake, and then just reacting to that. And when that happens, and I make a mistake on the podium, I'm just kind of like, well, like that happened. And there's sometimes I try to ignore it or whatever, but I feel like that's a very vulnerable moment, especially if it's a pretty, uh, noticeable mistake and everyone's like watching you. Like that's a very vulnerable situation to be in. And so my gut reaction is to own up to it. Honestly, if something happens in the show and I don't know if it was my fault or not, I usually take the blame for it. That's always my like first reaction. Like if I conduct something and a sub doesn't come in, I always think, oh well, I just didn't give it, correctly, and that's just me. But I find that being very vulnerable as well.
Oh, absolutely. And Dr. Tim Scott, who wrote I'm sorry, not Tim Scott, Tim Clark. Dr. Tim Clark wrote The Four Stages of Psychological Safety, and he talks about psychologically safe leaders providing air cover to their teams in situations like you just described. And that, that signals like, hey, I'm not going to let you take the fall for something that, we don't know the origin of yet. So I'm going to, I'm the one who's ultimately at the end of the day, the buck stops with me. I'll step in and kind of take the brunt of it. And I've found both observationally throughout my career and in the work that I've been doing on human-centered leadership, because of these kind of traditional norms of what leadership looks like. It's kind of based in a very um, autocratic, militaristic style. Vulnerability is hard even for leaders today. It's like I never want to look like I don't have the answer or the right answer. That would be even worse. Or I don't want to look weak in front of my team. They'll lose respect for me. I don't ever want them to see me upset or not knowing what to do. Like there's so much pressure that is self-imposed, and it's just not realistic. Leaders are human beings. They're going to make mistakes. Nobody's infallible and no one's an oracle. So I love that, you kind of just embrace that. And but that's definitely, I think, the thing that leaders of the two, transparency can also, because a lot of times leaders are privy to information that can't cascade any further until certain conversations are had or certain people are aligned. And that can get a little tricky of like, well, how much do I share and how much do I hold back? But the vulnerability piece seems to be the one that most leaders struggle with a little more.
Right. And I think, in our situation, like I said, we're doing the show. We've done the show over 300 times. And like, you have to be a robot to not mess up in those 300 times. I mean, even the simplest things, at some point in the show, you're going to make a mistake on something. And, it's everybody knows that in theater that has done a long, run of a show. It's like sooner or later something's going to happen. You're going to mess up this one spot, and it's all about how you handle that and um, again, remaining calm in those situations. But I think also you said like not knowing the answer to things. Like I have a great team. There's a supervisor of the show, Nick Finlow, who lives in London. He is my boss. Um, we have an in-house contractor who basically helps deal with the musicians and make sure they're at the theater on time. I communicate with him regularly on important things or issues that come up. Um, I have an associate conductor, music director, and he and I talk very frequently about things that need to be done, whether it's scheduling rehearsals or, what do you think about, this person, this person's playing or issues that might come up. Like I bounce things off of these people, and I think that it helps to kind of formulate an answer that we can give to the rest of the orchestra. So it definitely is a team. It is not me. There's a lot of people involved, and I think having that support is very important to giving the correct answer, giving the right information out at the right time.
And you sound like you really understand the value of, when things do happen, and if it's your error. I think leaders forget that how you model like dealing with that is also teachable. Like they're watching you. Your team is watching how you handle an embarrassing moment, how you handle being dressed down. They're watching how you handle it when when you drop the ball on something. Can you laugh at yourself? Can you take accountability and say, you know what, that was me. That was on me. Um, these are kind of like these cues that I think people don't see enough from their
Mm.
leaders, and it starts to kind of, rub against the authenticity piece.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's, I try to take accountability as much as I can. In situations like, yes, you're right, like that's a good word. It's like sometimes embarrassing when something happens and, you don't want to take the fall for it, but as a leader, I think that's important, to maintain your credibility and to maintain the respect of everyone that works under you. And we had a situation where a musician got injured from something that fell into the pit, and that was a very scary situation. And that's in a situation just making sure they're okay, making sure the orchestra is taken care of, and communicating with them, the person that got hurt, um, checking in on how this person's going to get help. It was a very scary situation. And um, again, it's remaining calm. It's dealing with the situation in a calm way, and talking to the right people and getting help as soon as possible. And so I think I learned a lot from that situation as well. But I think it's standing up for the people that you work with as well, to being a good leader.
Absolutely, being an advocate for
Mm.
them. Um, so I have one more question, and I think this is kind of the perfect way to wrap this up. But um, we I mentioned at the beginning that tolerance for the human condition really sits at the heart of human-centered leadership, and it's more or less kind of the idea that to have grace for other people and to recognize their humanity, we have to have grace for ourselves first, which requires a deep and profound level of self-awareness. How do you find grace for yourself in such a competitive, uh, fast moving, fast changing, demanding landscape?
Um, that's a good question. I think it's very evident when I make a mistake, in the show. Like if something happens where, um, whatever, something in the show happens where I make a mistake, I'm very hard on myself. I I do think that I'm a perfectionist and always want to do the right thing at the right time. And, so when something doesn't go exactly perfectly, I'm really hard on myself, and I think about it and I obsess about it, a long time. And that's a moment where I think I need to remember, to give myself grace on that and say, you've done this so many times. Like we were saying earlier, something's bound to happen. We're all human. Like that's what I think is so important to remember. And whether that's a mistake in the show, or whether that's, sending an email that's not, correct, or to the wrong person, or giving information out that shouldn't have been given out, or whatever it is, mistakes do happen. And that's in those moments, I try to remember to give myself grace for this, because, we're there's so much is happening in this industry, and it's like go go go. And I think we just have to remember that we're all human and we make mistakes. Yeah, I just want to say really quickly too, I think what has been so successful about our orchestra is, from the beginning, the contractor, who is in charge of finding the musicians, and the supervisor Nick and me, when we got together, we we were starting to put names together to form our orchestra of 18 people. We obviously wanted them to be great musicians, and the top musicians, but it was also equally important for them to be good people. And that was a huge requirement, for all of us. And because, like I said, we've been in pits where the situation is not that way, and it's not a great place to work. And we're hoping the show runs for a long time. And so, I think we succeeded in finding those people. And I think that is a real testament to why the environment in Back to the Future is such a great one. Everyone just loves being there. It's a really great vibe, and I think it all stems from that initial conversation of getting, good people. And I think that is the core of what it's about.
Chemistry and aligned values. That's
Yeah.
what I was thinking of when you were sharing that, which is beautiful, that your team went to that kind of next level in terms of bringing this group of people together who spend eight times a week together.
Yes,
Um,
in a small like hole in the ground in the dark. Yes, yes. It's a unique working experience.
oh, I can't imagine a better bow to put on this conversation than what you just shared. Ted, once again, thank you so very much for taking time out of your very busy schedule. This has been such a pleasure, and maybe we'll talk again at some point in the future. I would love that.
Love
Um,
that.
but yes, I hope that you have continued success, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much.